Have you ever felt so broken that even the sound of your own laughter seemed like a stranger? What if the world you once fought for turned its back on you, leaving you to rust in silence? And what if, against all odds, a single, untamed force could drag you back from the edge of despair? In the heart of Montana, under a sky so wide it could swallow your pain, a story began to unfold, one that would shatter the stillness of a forgotten life. A story of a man who once stood tall, now bound to a chair, and a creature as wild as the wind that would dare to challenge his darkness. But how could a broken soldier and a feral spirit ever find common ground? The answer lies in the dust and grit of a ranch lost to time, where miracles sometimes wear hoofprints. Under the relentless sun of the Big Sky country, where the Rockies loom like silent guardians, there lived a man named Jack Hensley. At 42, his frame was still broad-shouldered, a relic of the soldier he once was, but now it hunched over a weathered wheelchair. His hands, once steady enough to aim a rifle in the deserts of Iraq, now trembled when no one was looking. His eyes, a faded hazel, rarely met the world. They stayed fixed on the warped wooden porch of his family's old ranch, just outside of Bozeman. The ranch sprawled over acres of golden grass and rolling hills, dotted with pine trees that whispered in the wind. But to Jack, it was just a graveyard of memories. A rusted barbed wire fence marked the edge of his world, a line he hadn't crossed in years. The stars and stripes hung limp on a flagpole by the barn, a cruel reminder of the man he used to be, a man who'd left pieces of himself on foreign soil during a roadside blast that stole his legs and nearly his soul. Jack's mornings were a ritual of solitude, carved out in the shadow of the Absaroka Range. He'd roll out to the porch with a thermos of black coffee, strong as Montana winters, the kind his dad used to brew before dawn cattle drives. He'd sit there, watching the mist rise over the fields, the same fields where he'd learned to ride a horse before he could spell his own name. Back then, the air smelled of hay and hope. Now, it just smelled like dust. His calloused fingers would trace the edge of an old dog tag he kept in his pocket, the metal worn smooth from years of restless touch. It wasn't his. It belonged to a buddy who didn't make it back. Every morning, he'd mutter a quiet sorry under his breath, as if the wind could carry it to wherever souls rested. The pain in his chest wasn't just from shrapnel scars, it was from the weight of promises he couldn't keep, of lives he couldn't save. Neighbors in pickup trucks would wave as they drove past on the gravel road, their Stetsons tipped in a nod of respect, but Jack never waved back. He couldn't bear their pity, couldn't stand the whispers of that poor vet at the local diner over plates of biscuits and gravy. Days bled into one another like watercolor on a cheap canvas. Jack's life was a series of small, deliberate motions, rolling to the kitchen to heat up a can of chili, flipping through yellowed pages of Louis L'Amour westerns, or staring at the old rodeo trophies gathering dust on a shelf. His sister, Sarah, would drive up from Billings once a week, her old Chevy kicking up dirt as she hauled groceries and forced smiles. She'd chatter about church potlucks or the county fair, her voice a lifeline he pretended not to need. "You should come with me, Jack. Folks miss you at the VFW hall," she'd say, her Montana drawl soft but firm. He'd grunt, shrug, and watch her leave, knowing she'd cry in her truck before hitting the highway. He didn't mean to hurt her, but opening up felt like tearing open a wound that never healed. Inside, a storm raged, flashbacks of sand and screams, nights when he'd wake up gripping sheets soaked in sweat, half expecting to hear the crack of gunfire. He'd learned to shove it down, to bury it under layers of silence, but it simmered like a coal fire under the prairie, waiting for a spark. The ranch itself was falling apart, much like Jack. The barn's red paint had peeled to gray, and the corral where his dad once broke colts stood empty, overrun by thistle and sagebrush. He'd sold off the last of the cattle after the injury, unable to bear watching hired hands do what he no longer could. Money was tight, VA checks only stretched so far, but he'd sooner starve than ask for help. Sometimes he'd catch his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, seeing not a man but a ghost with a scruffy beard and hollow cheeks. He'd turn away, unable to face the stranger staring back, yet in the quietest moments, late at night, when the crickets sang and the moon turned the hills silver, he'd hear echoes of a promise he'd made, to live, not just survive. A promise he didn't know how to keep. It gnawed at him, a quiet ache beneath the numbness, a question without an answer. Was there anything left of the man who'd once believed in second chances? Then, on a Thursday morning in late August, when the air carried the first bite of autumn, something fractured the monotony of Jack's world. He was on the porch as usual, the coffee in his thermos gone cold, when a sound cut through the stillness, a sharp, wild snort followed by the thunder of hooves. His head snapped up, instincts from a past life kicking in, his heart pounding like it hadn't in years. Across the field, beyond the sagging fence, a shadow moved against the sunrise. It wasn't a deer or a stray dog, it was a horse, untamed and raw, its black coat gleaming like oil under the light. A Mustang straight out of the wilds of the Pryor Mountains, where herds still roamed free on federal land. Its mane whipped in the wind, muscles rippling with every defiant step, and its eyes, God, those eyes, burned with a fire Jack hadn't seen in himself since before the war. It pawed at the ground, snorting again, as if challenging the very earth beneath it. Jack gripped the arms of his chair, breath catching in his throat. He hadn't been this close to a horse in over a decade, not since the injury stole his ability to ride. The sight of it tore something open inside him, a memory of galloping through these same fields as a boy, the wind in his hair, the world wide open. But that was another life, another Jack. He watched, frozen, as the Mustang tossed its head and trotted closer to the fence, nostrils flaring as if it could smell the ghosts clinging to him. Then, in a moment that felt like a punch to the gut, the horse locked eyes with him. Not a fleeting glance, but a stare that seemed to strip away the years of walls he'd built. It was as if the animal saw right through the broken shell of Jack Hensley, down to the marrow of his pain, and refused to look away. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the Mustang turned, kicking up dust and vanishing into the tree line, leaving behind a silence louder than any explosion Jack had ever heard. He sat there, hands shaking worse than ever, the dog tag in his pocket feeling heavier than a stone. For the first time in years, a tear slipped down his cheek unnoticed as a single thought clawed its way to the surface. That horse wasn't just wild, it was a mirror of everything he'd lost, everything he'd buried. And somehow, in that fleeting clash of gazes, Jack felt something he hadn't dared to feel in a long damn time. A flicker of purpose, sharp and terrifying, cutting through the fog of his isolation. What had just happened? What did that Mustang want with a man who'd given up on himself? And why, after all these years of shutting out the world, did his heart ache to follow it into the unknown? That fleeting moment with the Mustang left Jack Hensley rattled in a way he hadn't been since the day he woke up in a hospital bed with half his body gone. Sitting there on the porch, the Montana dawn still bleeding orange across the horizon, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He clenched the arms of his wheelchair until his knuckles turned white, as if holding on could stop the storm breaking loose inside him. That horse, those untamed, piercing eyes, had ripped open something he'd spent years burying. It wasn't just an animal. It was a ghost of the man he used to be, a mirror of the freedom he'd lost, and it hurt worse than the shrapnel scars crisscrossing his chest. His breath came in jagged bursts, each one tasting of dust and regret. Why now? Why, after all this time of numbness, did his heart feel like it was being torn out of his ribcage? He wiped a stray tear with the back of his hand, angry at himself for feeling anything at all. He'd built walls for a reason, to keep the pain out, to keep the memories locked away, but that Mustang had kicked right through them, leaving him raw and exposed. Inside, Jack wrestled with a tangle of emotions he couldn't name. Guilt gnawed at him first, sharp and familiar, whispering that he didn't deserve to feel alive, not when so many of his brothers-in-arms never made it home. He pulled the dog tag from his pocket, the one that wasn't his, and stared at the name etched into the metal, St. Daniel Rivera, Danny, the kid who'd cracked jokes in the Humvee minutes before the blast, whose laughter still echoed in Jack's nightmares. "I'm sorry," he muttered again, voice barely a rasp, as if saying it for the 1,000th time could change anything. But behind the guilt, something uglier stirred. Fear. Fear that this flicker of purpose, this ache to follow that wild horse into the unknown, would only lead to more disappointment. He was a broken man, bound to a chair, living on a rotting ranch in the middle of nowhere. What could he possibly do with a creature that embodied everything he wasn't, wild, free, unbroken? Yet even as he tried to smother it, a sliver of longing clawed its way up, begging him to chase that feeling, to remember who he was before the war chewed him up and spat him out. It terrified him, because wanting something meant risking everything, and Jack wasn't sure he had anything left to lose. The next few days were a slow descent into a different kind of hell. That Mustang didn't stay gone. It came back day after day, always at dawn, lingering just beyond the rusted barbed wire fence that marked the edge of Jack's shrunken world. Each time it stood there watching him with an intensity that felt almost personal, snorting and pawing at the earth, as if daring him to do something, anything. Jack tried to ignore it, tried to stick to his routine of cold coffee and silence, but his eyes kept betraying him, drawn to the black silhouette against the rising sun. The horse became an obstacle he couldn't roll past, a living symbol of the life he'd abandoned. It was taunting him, or so it felt, rubbing salt into the wound of his limitations. He couldn't ride, couldn't even stand, so why did it keep showing up? Why did it look at him like it knew something he didn't? The tension tightened like a noose when Sarah came by that Saturday, her Chevy rumbling up the gravel drive with a bag of groceries and the same forced cheer she always wore. Jack was on the porch, staring at the empty field where the Mustang had been an hour earlier when she stepped out, her boots crunching on the dirt. She was in her late 30s, wiry from years of hard work, with crow's feet that deepened when she smiled, though today her hazel eyes, mirror images of his, held a flicker of concern. "Hey, Jackie," she started, setting the bag down with a thud. "Brought you some of Ma's old recipe chili fixins. Thought we could cook together like the old days." Jack grunted, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to pretend everything was fine, but Sarah wasn't one to let silence sit. She dragged a rickety chair over and sat beside him, her hands fussing with the hem of her flannel shirt. "You look worse than usual," she said, half teasing, half serious. "What's eatin' at you? And don't say nothing, 'cause I ain't buying it." He didn't answer right away, just kept tracing the edge of Danny's dog tag in his pocket. The weight of her question pressed against the dam he'd built around his thoughts, and for a moment he considered letting it spill. But the words stuck in his throat, heavy as lead. "Just tired," he finally muttered, hoping she'd drop it. Sarah didn't. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, her voice softening. "Jack, I ain't blind. Something's got you spooked. I seen you looking off into the fields like you're waiting for a ghost to ride up. Talk to me, please." The please cut deeper than he expected. It carried years of worry, of watching her brother fade into a shell of himself, and it dragged up memories he didn't want to face, memories of better times when they'd raced horses across this very ranch, laughing under the endless Montana sky. Back then, he'd been her protector, her big brother who could do no wrong. Now, he was just a burden she refused to let go of. Anger flared hot in his chest, not at her, but at himself. "Ain't nothing to talk about, Sarah," he snapped, sharper than he meant to. "Just leave it." Her face fell, just for a second, before she masked it with a tight smile. "All right, then," she said quietly, standing up. "I'll be in the kitchen if you change your mind." She paused at the door, turning back with a look that held more pain than pity. "You don't gotta carry it all alone, you know. Whatever it is, I'm still here, always will be." Her words lingered long after she disappeared inside, each one a splinter under Jack's skin. He hated how much he was hurting her, hated that he couldn't find the strength to let her in. But opening up meant reliving the past, meant admitting how much he'd failed, not just Danny, not just his squad, but himself. The flashbacks were bad enough without giving them voice, without dragging Sarah into the mess of his mind. He stared out at the field again, half hoping, half dreading the Mustang would show up, if only to distract him from the ache her words left behind. That night, sleep was a lost cause. Jack lay in his bed, the ranch house creaking around him like an old man's bones, while the wind howled outside. His mind dragged him back to Iraq, to the heat and the dust, to the moment everything shattered. He could still feel the jolt of the explosion, hear Danny's last choked laugh before the world went black. When he jolted awake, sweat soaking through his shirt, his chest heaved like he'd run a mile. He fumbled for the dog tag on his nightstand, clutching it like a lifeline, but it offered no comfort, just more weight. He rolled to the window, pushing the curtain aside to stare at the moonlit field. No Mustang, just emptiness. And yet, in that stillness, the question burned hotter. Why did that horse keep coming back? What did it want from him? Or was it just a figment of his fractured mind, a cruel trick conjured by his own longing for something he couldn't have? The next morning, spurred by a restless need he couldn't shake, Jack did something he hadn't in years. He rolled himself down the uneven dirt path toward the old barn, the wheels of his chair catching on rocks and roots. The barn stood like a relic at the edge of the ranch, its faded red paint peeling under the harsh Montana sun, a testament to a life he'd walked away from. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of moldy hay and forgotten dreams. Cobwebs draped the rafters, and shafts of light pierced through cracked boards, illuminating dust motes that danced like ghosts. He stopped in the middle of the empty space, his breath hitching as he spotted something tucked in the corner, a weathered wooden box, half hidden under a pile of old saddle blankets. He maneuvered closer, his arms straining as he pushed through the debris and pried the lid open with trembling hands. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed with age, tied with a frayed ribbon. His heart stuttered as he recognized his father's handwriting on the top envelope, addressed to him in a scrawl he hadn't seen since he was a boy. His dad had died when Jack was still overseas, felled by a heart attack while branding cattle under this very roof. Jack had never gotten to say goodbye, never got to read these. He unfolded the first letter, the paper crinkling under his touch, and the words hit him like a punch. "Jackie, my boy," it began, the familiar nickname a knife to the gut. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, being out there saving the world and all, but I need you to know something. This ranch, these hills, they're more than dirt and grass. They're your roots, son. They'll hold you when nothing else will. I ain't much for words, but if you're ever lost, come back here, break a colt, feel the wind, remember who you are. I'll be waiting in every sunrise, every hoofbeat. Love, Pa." Jack's throat closed up, his vision blurring as he clutched the letter to his chest. The words weren't just a message, they were a plea, a reminder of a legacy he'd abandoned when he sold off the cattle, when he let the corral go to ruin. He rifled through more letters, each one a piece of his father's quiet strength, each one a brick in the wall of guilt he'd been carrying. One letter mentioned a specific memory, breaking a young Mustang together when Jack was 12, right here in this barn under the shadow of the Absaroka Range. "You had a gift, son," his dad had written. "Ain't no horse you couldn't read, no spirit you couldn't touch." Jack let out a broken laugh, bitter and raw. A gift? What good was it now, when he couldn't even stand? But the letters weren't the only discovery. Tucked beneath them was a photograph, grainy and faded, of him and Sarah as kids, sitting on the corral fence with their dad, all three grinning under wide-brimmed hats as a dappled mare grazed behind them. Jack's fingers lingered on the image, tracing the outline of his younger self, a boy who believed the world was his to conquer, who hadn't yet learned how cruel it could be. The photo dragged up a flood of memories, of long rides through Yellowstone National Park, just a few hours from here, where the geysers bubbled like the Earth's heartbeat and the bison roamed as untamed as the Mustang outside. They'd camped there as a family, under stars so bright they felt close enough to touch, and his dad had told stories of old cowboys and wild horses, tales that made Jack dream of a life bigger than the ranch. Now that park, that symbol of raw, unbridled nature, felt like a taunt, a reminder of everything he couldn't reach anymore. He was still holding the photo when Sarah's voice cut through the silence, soft but startled. "Jack, what are you doing out here?" She stood in the barn doorway, a dish towel over her shoulder, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. He didn't turn, didn't answer right away. Just kept staring at the picture like it could pull him back in time. She stepped closer, her boots scuffing against the hay-strewn floor, and peered over his shoulder. "Pa's letters," she whispered, her voice thick. "I forgot we even had those." "Yeah," Jack managed, his tone gruff to hide the crack in it. "Found more than I bargained for." Sarah knelt beside him, her hand hovering like she wanted to touch his shoulder but didn't dare. "He'd be proud of you, you know," she said quietly, "even after everything. He always said you had a fire in you, same as them wild horses he loved so much." Jack's jaw tightened, her words slicing through him. Proud? How could anyone be proud of a man who'd given up? He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but instead, something else slipped out, raw and unfiltered. "There's a horse been coming round the past few days. A Mustang, wild as hell. Keeps staring at me like it's waiting for something." Sarah's eyes searched his, a flicker of hope breaking through her worry. "Maybe it is," she said softly. "Maybe it's waiting for you to remember what it feels like to fight for something." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Jack felt the walls inside him tremble. Fight for something. He hadn't fought for anything since the day he came home half a man. But the Mustang, the letters, Sarah's quiet faith, it was all piling up, pressing against the numbness he'd clung to for so long. He didn't want to hope, didn't want to risk shattering what little peace he'd carved out, but the ache in his chest was growing, morphing into something he couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, the Mustang's visits became a battleground for Jack's warring emotions. Each morning, he'd roll out to the porch, thermos in hand, and there it would be, just beyond the fence, its black coat gleaming under the rising sun. Sometimes it stood still, watching him with that unnerving gaze. Other times it paced, hooves kicking up dirt, as if impatient for him to make a move. Jack's frustration grew with every encounter, frustration at his own helplessness, at the horse's persistence, at the way it seemed to pull him apart piece by piece. He started talking to it, muttering under his breath, half expecting it to answer. "What do you want from me?" he'd growl, his voice lost in the wind. "I ain't got nothing to give." But the horse wasn't the only weight bearing down on him. Sarah kept pushing, gentle but relentless, dropping hints about the old corral, about maybe fixing it up, about getting help from the locals to trap the Mustang and see if Jack could work with it. "You used to be the best hand with a colt in 3 counties, she'd say, her tone casual but loaded. "Folks still talk about it down at the diner." Jack wanted to snap at her, to tell her to stop digging up the past, but he couldn't ignore the spark her words lit, no matter how much he tried to stomp it out. Meanwhile, the ranch itself seemed to conspire against his isolation. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, reminders of how far he'd let things slide. VA checks couldn't cover the repairs the place desperately needed. He knew selling was an option. New developers had been sniffing around for years, but the thought of letting go of his dad's legacy felt like burying him all over again. The real breaking point came on a crisp morning a week after finding the letters, when Jack rolled out to the porch and saw the Mustang closer than ever before. It had crossed the sagging fence somehow, standing just a stone's throw away, its nostrils flaring as it snorted a challenge. Jack's heart pounded, a mix of fear and something primal surging through him. Up close, the horse was even more imposing, its muscles taut, scars crisscrossing its flank like battle wounds of its own. It looked like it had fought for every inch of its freedom, just as Jack once had. For a long moment they stared at each other, two broken warriors sizing up the other's damage. Then, without warning, the Mustang reared, hooves slashing the air, before bolting back toward the tree line, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Jack sat frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears, until Sarah's voice broke the spell. She'd come out behind him unnoticed, and her tone was quieter than usual. "Jack, you can't keep running from this. That horse, it's given you a chance. I don't know why, but it is. Don't let it slip away." Her words were the final crack in the dam. Jack felt something snap inside him, a flood of anger, fear, and desperate need pouring out. He turned to her, his voice rough and trembling. "And what if I fail, Sarah? What if I try and it breaks me worse than I already am? I couldn't save Danny. Couldn't save myself. How am I supposed to save a damn horse?" Sarah's eyes glistened, but she didn't flinch. "You don't gotta save it, Jack. Maybe it's here to save you. But you'll never know if you don't try. Ain't that worth something?" Her question hung between them, heavy as the Montana sky, and for the first time in years, Jack didn't have a grunt or a shrug to push it away. He looked out at the field, at the dust still settling from the Mustang's retreat, and felt the weight of a decision pressing down on him. He could keep hiding, keep letting the ranch and himself rot, or he could do something. Something reckless, something terrifying, something that might just prove he was still alive. His hands tightened on the arms of his chair, the dog tag in his pocket burning against his thigh, and in that moment he knew he couldn't turn back, not anymore. So, with a shaky breath and a nod to Sarah that said more than words ever could, Jack made his choice. "Get the corral fixed," he said, his voice low but steady for the first time in what felt like forever. "And find someone who knows how to trap a Mustang. I'm going to do this. I don't know how, but I'm going to do this." Sarah's face lit up with a mix of shock and relief, and she nodded, wiping her eyes before he could see. "All right, Jackie. All right." As she turned to make the calls, Jack looked out at the field again, his chest tight with a fear he hadn't felt since the war, but also with something else, something like purpose, flickering to life after years in the dark. He didn't know if he could tame that Mustang, didn't know if he could even tame himself, but for the first time in a long damn time, he was ready to try. Before we go any further, if this story of grit and redemption is pulling at your heartstrings, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got more chapters of Jack's journey coming, and you won't want to miss a single moment as he fights to reclaim his life, one hoofbeat at a time. Jack rolled back toward the ranch house, the weight of his decision settling over him like a storm cloud over the Rockies. He knew this was just the beginning, knew the road ahead would be rougher than any desert trail he'd ever walked. But as the wind whispered through the pines and the shadow of the Absaroka Range loomed in the distance, he felt it. A spark, small but stubborn, burning through the fog. That Mustang wasn't just a horse. It was a mirror, a challenge, a shot at something he thought he'd lost forever. And as he braced himself for whatever came next, one truth cut through the haze. If he didn't fight for this, didn't fight for himself, then all the sacrifices, Danny's, his own, his family's, would mean nothing. He wasn't just chasing a horse, he was chasing the man he used to be, the man he still might become, if only he could find the courage to ride into the storm. The days following Jack Hensley's decision to chase after the Mustang, and maybe, just maybe, a piece of himself, were a blur of grit and ache under the sprawling Montana sky. The air bit sharper now, autumn sinking its teeth into the big sky country, as if nature itself was testing his resolve. Sarah didn't waste a moment, rounding up a few old hands from Bozeman, weathered men with calloused palms and stories etched into their wrinkles, who'd known their way around a wild horse since before Jack was born. They hauled lumber and tools up the gravel drive, their pickup trucks kicking up dust that settled on Jack's porch like a gritty reminder of change. The corral, once a tangle of thistle and broken dreams, started to take shape again, plank by plank, under the shadow of the Absaroka Range. Each hammer strike echoed through the ranch, a heartbeat Jack couldn't ignore, even as it rattled the numbness he'd clung to for so long. He'd roll out each morning, thermos of black coffee in hand, watching from the sidelines as the men worked, their laughter and gruff banter a foreign sound against the silence he'd built his life around. Inside, a war raged. Part of him wanted to bolt, to retreat back to the safety of isolation, while another part, raw and trembling, hungered for what might lie on the other side of this gamble. The Mustang hadn't shown up since that day it crossed the fence, and the absence gnawed at him, a taunt whispering that maybe he'd dreamed it all, that maybe he was too late. His hands shook worse than ever, not just from the cold, but from the weight of a hope he wasn't sure he could carry. What if he failed? What if this was just another wound waiting to scar over, the tension coiled tighter each day, a rope pulled taut, ready to snap, as Jack wrestled with the fear that he was reaching for something he no longer deserved. When the corral was finally finished, its fresh pine beams gleaming under the weak October sun, the real work began. One of the old-timers, a wiry man named Cal with a face like cracked leather, had tracked Mustangs in the Pryor Mountains for decades. He'd set out with a couple others, armed with rope and patience, following hoofprints and whispers of a black stallion roaming the federal lands. Jack stayed behind, unable to join the hunt, his wheelchair a bitter anchor on the porch as he waited, hour by hour, for news. Sarah kept him company when she could, her presence a quiet strength, though her eyes betrayed the same worry he felt in his bones. "They'll find him, Jack," she'd say, her voice soft but steady, as she handed him a fresh cup of coffee. "And when they do, you'll know what to do. You always did with horses." Her faith cut deeper than doubt, because it forced him to confront the man he used to be, the boy who could read a colt's spirit with a glance, who'd broken dozens under his dad's watchful eye. But that boy was buried under years of sand and screams, under the weight of a body that no longer answered his call. Each passing day, without word from Cal, twisted the knife further, until Jack's mind became a battlefield of its own, replaying every failure, every loss. Danny's laughter echoed in the quiet moments, a ghost that wouldn't let him rest, murmuring that he didn't have the right to start over. The dog tag in his pocket felt heavier than ever, a millstone dragging him down, and more than once he nearly told Sarah to call it off, to let the corral rot again, to let him rot with it. But her quiet nods, the way she'd squeeze his shoulder without a word, kept him tethered, even as the fear of breaking, truly breaking, loomed larger than the Rockies themselves. It was on a Thursday morning, when the first frost dusted the fields like shattered glass, that the roar of engines broke the dawn. Jack's heart lurched as he rolled out to the porch, his breath catching in the chill air. Cal's old Ford led a small convoy, a horse trailer rattling behind it, kicking up gravel as they pulled up near the corral. Sarah was already there, her hands clasped tight, her face a mix of hope and nerves. Cal climbed out, his Stetson tipped back, a grim nod in Jack's direction. "Got him," he said, voice rough as the terrain they'd crossed. "He's a fighter, all right. Damn near killed us getting him in. You sure about this, Hensley? He ain't gonna make it easy." Jack didn't answer right away, his gaze locked on the trailer as it shook with the force of something wild, something untamed. Hooves slammed against metal, a furious snort cutting through the morning, and Jack felt it, a jolt straight to his core, like the Mustang's rage mirrored his own. He nodded, jaw tight, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. This was it. No turning back. But as they opened the trailer and the black Mustang exploded out, all sinew and fury, charging the corral fence with a scream that could wake the dead, Jack's stomach dropped. Up close, the horse was even more broken than he remembered. Scars latticed its flank, one ear torn, its eyes wild with a pain that wasn't just physical. It wasn't just a mirror. It was a reflection of every wound Jack carried, every scar he hid. And in that moment, as the Mustang tore at the earth, dust swirling like a storm, Jack realized this wasn't just about taming a horse. It was about taming himself. The tension snapped tauter than a bowstring, every muscle in his body screaming to retreat, to let someone else handle this beast. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. If he ran now, he'd never stop running. The next weeks were a crucible, a test of will that burned hotter than any desert sun Jack had ever faced. Working with the Mustang, whom he'd started calling Shadow, for the way it haunted his every thought, wasn't just hard, it was soul-wrenching. He couldn't ride, couldn't even stand, so he adapted, rolling his chair out to the corral each day, closer than he'd been to life in years. Cal and the others helped at first, teaching him how to lure Shadow with grain, how to speak in low, steady tones that carried over the wind. But it was Jack's battle, and everyone knew it. Shadow fought every step, rearing and snapping, his hooves a blur of defiance, as if he could smell Jack's doubt. There were days Jack nearly gave up, when Shadow charged the fence so hard it splintered, when the horse's haunted eyes seemed to mock his own brokenness. Flashbacks hit harder then, the corral blurring into sand and blood, Danny's face flashing before him mid-panic, until he had to grip the arms of his chair just to stay grounded. "I can't do this," he'd mutter to himself, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold, the dog tag in his pocket a burning coal. But then he'd think of Sarah's quiet faith, of his dad's letters tucked away in the barn, of a promise to live, not just survive. And he'd push forward one painful inch at a time, talking to Shadow like he was an old friend, telling him about Iraq, about Danny, about the weight he carried every damn day. "We're both messed up, huh?" he'd rasp, half expecting the horse to bolt at the sound of his voice. But slowly, impossibly, Shadow started to listen. Not trust, not yet, but listen. Ears twitching, pacing slower, those wild eyes meeting Jack's with something less like rage and more like recognition. It wasn't a victory, not by a long shot, but it was a crack in the wall, a sliver of light in the dark, and it kept Jack coming back, day after frostbitten day, even as the effort carved new lines into his face and left his arms aching from pushing his chair through the uneven dirt. The true turning point came on a grey November afternoon, when the sky hung heavy with the threat of snow, and Jack was alone at the corral, Sarah and the others gone into town for supplies. He'd been talking to Shadow again, softer this time, holding out a handful of grain from his chair, when the horse did something it hadn't before. It stopped pacing, stopped snorting, and took a single tentative step forward, then another. Jack's breath hitched, his hand trembling as Shadow's muzzle dipped closer, the heat of its breath ghosting over his fingers. For a moment, time froze, the world narrowing to just the two of them, two broken souls staring down the abyss together. Then, with a gentleness that shattered something deep in Jack's chest, Shadow took the grain, its rough lips brushing his palm, before stepping back, eyes locked on his. It wasn't taming, not fully, but it was trust, raw and fragile, offered from one wounded warrior to another. Jack's vision blurred, tears he hadn't shed in years spilling over as he let out a shaky laugh, the sound foreign and jagged in his throat. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not to Shadow, but to Danny, to himself, to everyone he'd pushed away. It was a confession, a release, poured out into the cold air as the weight of a decade's guilt shifted, not gone, but lighter, just enough to breathe. He sat there long after Shadow retreated to the far end of the corral, hands still outstretched, feeling the ghost of that touch, knowing something had changed, not just between him and the horse, but within himself. For the first time since the blast, Jack felt like he wasn't just surviving, he was fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it took root, stubborn as the pines dotting the Montana hills. Jack's mornings no longer started with cold coffee and staring into nothingness. Now they began at the corral, rolling out before the sun peeked over the horizon, a thermos still in hand, but a purpose in his chest. Shadow wasn't tame, not by any stretch. There were still days of fury, of hooves slashing the air, but there was progress, a dance of patience and persistence that mirrored Jack's own slow crawl back to life. He started talking more, not just to the horse, but to Sarah, to Cal, even to the neighbors who'd stopped by, curious about the black Mustang and the broken vet who'd taken it on. His words came haltingly at first, rough as gravel, but they came, stories of the war, of Danny, of the ranch as it used to be. Sarah noticed the shift most, her smiles less forced, her laughter brighter as she watched her brother emerge from the shadows. "You're still in there, Jackie," she'd say, her voice thick with pride, and for once Jack didn't shrug it off. The ranch itself seemed to breathe again. Jack used some of his VA savings to fix the barn roof, to clear the thistle from the fields, small steps toward honoring his dad's legacy. But the biggest change was internal, a quiet strength blooming where numbness once reigned. He wasn't whole, not yet, maybe not ever, but he was more than a ghost in a chair. He was Jack Hensley, fighter, brother, rancher, a man learning to live with his scars instead of hiding behind them. Yet transformation demanded sacrifice, and Jack knew what he had to give up. Late one evening, as the first snow dusted the ground and the corral stood quiet under a silver moon, he rolled out to Shadow's side, the dog tag clutched tight in his fist. He'd carried Danny's memory like a chain, a penance for surviving when his friend hadn't, but now he understood. Holding on to guilt wasn't honoring Danny, it was burying him all over again. With trembling fingers, he tied the tag to the corral fence, right where Shadow often stood, the metal glinting in the moonlight as a soft wind stirred. "I'm living, Danny," he murmured, voice breaking. "Not just for me, for you too. I hope that's enough." It was a renunciation of the weight he'd shouldered alone, a letting go of the past stranglehold, offered up to the night and the wild spirit of the horse who dragged him back to life. He didn't cry this time, but he felt the shift, a hollow ache replaced by something softer, something like peace, as he rolled back to the house, leaving the tag behind as a sentinel of a promise kept. In the days that followed, Jack and Shadow reached a quiet understanding, a bond forged not in dominance, but in mutual survival. The Mustang never fully lost its wildness. It still tossed its mane at strangers, still pawed the earth when the wind howled, but it let Jack near, let him brush its scarred flank with hands that no longer shook. Sarah watched it all unfold, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And on a crisp December morning, as snow blanketed the ranch in a hush, she stood beside Jack at the corral, her arm looped through his. "Pa would have loved this," she said softly, her voice a thread of warmth against the cold. "You and that horse, two of a kind." Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips, the first real one in years, as he looked out at Shadow grazing near the fence, the dog tag glinting faintly in the winter light. The image burned itself into his heart. Man, horse, and a piece of the past left to rest, framed against the endless Montana sky, a testament to battles fought and a life reclaimed. It wasn't a perfect ending. Life never was. There'd be more hard days, more ghosts creeping in at night, but for now, standing there with his sister, with Shadow as a silent witness, Jack felt something he'd thought was lost forever. Home. Time, they say, is both a thief and a healer, stealing what we hold dear, but stitching the wounds in silence thread by thread until we're whole enough to stand again. War breaks more than bones. It fractures spirits, scatters dreams across forgotten fields, but in the quiet corners of the world, like this weathered ranch under a sky too vast for pain. Healing whispers through the wind, through the hoofbeats of a wild heart, through the courage to start over. Jack Hensley learned that rebeginning isn't about erasing the past, it's about carrying it forward, lighter, with hands ready to rebuild. And as the snow fell, covering old scars in a blanket of new beginnings, he knew some battles are worth fighting, even if the only victory is finding yourself again. If Jack's story has tugged at your heart, if it's reminded you of the quiet strength in second chances, leave a comment below with "I believe in healing." Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, someone who might be fighting their own silent war. And if you want to stay with us for more stories of grit and redemption, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's so much more to come, and we'd love to have you along for the ride.